Politics as Usual at usualpolitics.com. I'm Dr. Moriel McDuffy, and I want to have a talk about why racism is totally illogical. Totally illogical. No person of color should ever, and I mean ever, 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 internalize racism. What do I mean by internalize? So I'll give you an example first. I worked with a kid in a program that I was running at the time. And this particular program, I was working with kids who were on probation. And this particular kid looked at me and said, when you see black people, they're working at McDonald's. But when you see white people, they have nice jobs and they're working out of offices and they make good money. So this kid totally ignored the fact that I did not work at McDonald's, that I was running this program, and that really most of our staff was black who was running the program. So they had a lot of, multiple black supervisors in one building. So he internalized some of the racist attitudes that were around him. He actually integrated them into himself. And it does you harm, because that means he's going to limit himself throughout his life based on somebody else's idea of what smart is, right? Or what he saw in his immediate environment. And then also what he ignored in his immediate environment, because he totally ignored the fact that I was the director of this particular program. So when we're talking about racism, what is it, first of all? Racism comprises two different components. The first component is one group is superior based on their race. The second component of the first component is that one group is inferior based on their race, right? So the second component of the definition is the discrimination practices, right? So people in one group, right, say that so the KKK, they believe that whites are superior. And as a result, they believe that everybody else around, Jews, blacks, whoever, are inferior. And they actively discriminate and try to intimidate because of their belief in superiority, right? Which makes little sense. And this is why it makes little sense. Because if you're actually superior to somebody, why would you need to discriminate, right? It would be like Michael Jordan's Bulls who won 6 championships, just trying to cheat, for a championship. When they're better than they knew they were better than the other team. So if you really look at it, it doesn't make any sense when you know you're better to go out and try to discriminate. So if you look at really what racism is, that part of it's illogical. So the only reason why somebody would have to discriminate would be because maybe you're doing better than them. Maybe they don't want to risk losing a job to you, right? So when we're talking about racism, there's different types of racism. And I'm not going to get into every type of racism, but we know about job discrimination. You go into an interview, they don't hire you maybe because you're black. Or maybe you don't even get the interview because when they get your application, you have an ethnic name, so they decide, can't hire them, right? When you look at other types of discrimination like housing, racial profiling by police, amongst other things, there's a large load and a large amount of discrimination that occurs in our society. So the second reason that racism is illogical, and this is a biggie, is because there's less than a 1% difference in the human genome in all human beings. So there's a fraction of a percentage of difference between everybody, including whites, blacks, Asians, Latinos, Native Americans. There's less than a 1% difference. What does that mean, right? And it means that while we look different, our noses can look different, different hair, different complexions, our bodily functions are the same. Our organs are the same. Our appendages are the same. There's only one major difference. And that major difference is melanin. So what is melanin? Melanin is a pigment, and it's in our skin and hair, and it ranges from brown to black. And it's the reason why, if you're brown or black, that you have the color that you have. So literally, when people say the color of your skin is why you're discriminating against, that's literally what it is. So there's no difference in your brain. Nobody's necessarily born innately smarter or innately better. All that is nonsense. Science has shown that really people are mostly the same. So when you think about racism on that front, it's very illogical. It's very illogical. And for somebody who's born with with more pigment, more melanin, you end up having more barriers, and not just because the melanin, but because some people benefit from you not being successful. There's people that benefit from that. So if you really look at racism, it is about holding people back, not about superiority or inferiority. Don't fall into it. Lastly, I want to talk to you about a psychological concept called in-group bias. So in-group bias is a concept that's existed since the beginning of time. So if we go back to hunter and gatherer times, everybody was in a tribe, and a tribe essentially is a group. When you're in that group, that group was your lifeblood, right? If you were out on your own in the wild, then it was unlikely you were going to be able to survive. There were wild animal attacks. You had to hunt and gather to survive, and you had to, know how to work the land. But also, there were other groups around. So people depended on that group, and you believed in your group, and you had bias against other groups. You weren't trusting the other groups. So this mentality of, oh, this is my group, this is how I survive, continued throughout industrialized society all the way into modern day. So if you think about in-group bias, right, the best way that I can think about it is very simple. Is just think about high school. Think about how many groups are in high school. The athletes, or some people call them jocks. Some people have a group they call the nerds, maybe the college prep students. Maybe they got different names for them now. They have groups of people who live in certain areas, right? But there's different groups of people, and oftentimes you think unfavorably towards another group. So the athletes may think the college prep kids are nerds, right? And you see it with adults as well. You have groups of people with money, and they might have these attitudes towards the poor, right? I mean, we can see it in our own in this administration now, right? As far as our president, we can see how a bunch of billionaires are getting tax cuts, and that's tied to the money that people need during COVID-19, and that's a whole nother issue. But there are certain attitudes that come along with that, right? And people have certain beliefs. Oh, people don't work hard enough. Oh, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? So if we're looking at in-group bias, how does that work against racism? There's people who are passive racists, right? And I know we talked about direct discrimination versus passive discrimination. But I'm going to focus on passive right now. But be assured that in-group bias does affect direct discrimination as well. But passive discriminators, they still see their group as better, and they don't acknowledge racism. Maybe they don't go out and try to directly discriminate, but they ignore it, and it never exists to them in their mind, because and they make excuses. So if somebody works in HR and they have the in-groups bias, and two candidates come in, one's black, one's white, they look at that familiarity. Oh, he reminds me of where I'm from, an upper middle class neighborhood. He looks like somebody that could have lived next door, right? But this person does not, right? In-group bias. I'm taking him, he's part of my group. I'm not taking that black person, he's not part of my group. They don't see it. They may not say it, but subconsciously, it's the differences that push that candidate away, right? As well, maybe somebody else is the discriminator, and the passive person sees it, but they don't acknowledge it. And then they go to the stereotypes for the rationale. Well, it wasn't that. Their person just doesn't work hard enough. That person is not smart enough. So that's how those stereotypes play in, because whenever you see your group is favorable and the other group is unfavorable, there's always going to be a reason. There's always going to be a reason. And, and the stereotypes, the in-group's bias, and the discrimination, they all work in one to create this environment where people are discriminated against. So if when you think about in-group's bias, I just want you to think about how you see yourself and look at yourself and say, hey, what group am I with, right? So if I was to look at me, I'm obviously African American, but I'm also a PhD. I also have, certain family members that are educated, and so I might think of myself in multiple groups. But if I start to think about other groups as inferior or as in unfavorable ways, that's when discrimination can happen, right? So I also encourage all African Americans and people of color in general, do not ever internalize anything anybody says, because at the end of the day, right, it's illogical. We know that people have tremendous bias, and everybody does. That in-group bias is real. It's not just limited to white people. It's black people, Latinos. Everybody has in-group bias. So when you have power, how do you use that? Or how do you avoid, exercising that in-group bias to make excuses and or to directly discriminate, right? KKK in-group bias says that if you're not white or Aryan, of the white Aryan race, pure blood, then you're inferior, right? So, and they act accordingly. They discriminate as much as they can, even if it's just intimidation or name calling on the street. So we need to work out of just our typical group mentality, and actually see what other people are about. Not just stay there and assume that people are about something that's stereotypical. As well, just as far as racism, if you're angry in a moment about something racist that happens, fine. But don't ever internalize and take that into you, because there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing different about you. Less than a 1% genome difference. And you can achieve. And as an African American male, and knowing Black history, which not much is really taught in schools, I can tell you there's a lot of African Americans that have achieved in the face of dire odds. People, part of the racism is to ignore those achievements and to pay more attention to the people that are doing bad. And rightfully so, you should pay attention to the people who are doing bad at times, but you also should highlight the accomplishments, which we don't see enough of. So that's it for today. Politics as usual at usualpolitics.com. Check us out for more stories. And this was a heart-to-heart